All right. Hello, hello, hello. There we go. All right, I won't do the clapping hands. All right, quiet, please. Shh. It's amazing how that works. So this panel is going to be talking about a term that, frankly, a year ago, if you'd said to me day zero, I would have thought it was a bad science fiction movie. And it's now basically entered into the lexicon. This is an issue that we're going to talk about centered around Cape Town, but as I said briefly in my presentation, this is a much bigger issue than Cape Town. I said Barcelona a few years ago essentially ran out of water. They had to bring in tankers from Marseille. Sao Paulo, the biggest city in Brazil, is in desperate straits. And so the notion that a major metropolitan area could literally run out of a secure supply of water has become a reality. And it's something that has enormous implications for how we manage our resources, infrastructure, planning, scenario planning. We've got a terrific panel to talk about that. Buzz Thompson is going to speak first. Buzz is a great friend and colleague. He is the main environmental law person at Stanford University, former head of the Woods Institute, and it's not an exaggeration to say that he is the leading water law scholar in the country. When the Supreme Court wanted someone to serve as a special master for Montana and Wyoming, they called Buzz. Our other speaker is going to be Jim Lochhead. He knows many of you, or you know him, CEO of Denver Water since 2010. So if we could bring up the poll. So we're gonna start this just to get a sense of folks' perceptions on whether day zero is something that the Coloradans should be focused on or not. So the question we'd like you to text to is, do you expect a major city in Colorado to declare a day zero in your lifetime? Wow, so pretty evenly split. Okay. Yep. All right, if we could put up the second as well. So pretty evenly split. The second question, which we'll get up in a sec, is if I'll do this from memory, if a major city were to declare a day zero, it would be primarily due to, and then you're going to get four options. There we go. Lake Powell, inadequate water conservation, reliance too much on a single source, or lack of funding. And obviously, the Powell and single source supply has some overlap. Okay, so we're getting a good sense. So too much reliance on a single source, and obviously if that source is Lake Powell, then it's hard to know which one to vote for. If you could bring up Buzz's slides, please. And Buzz, let me just hand it over to you.
So it's a great pleasure to be here today. I generally speak to an audience in California, like the Association of California Water Agencies, ACWA. So it's a great pleasure to be here in Colorado and actually find out both the similarities and differences between your water challenges and those that we face in California. The other major area I work in addition to the Western United States, is Africa. And I actually taught water in South Africa 3 years ago at a time when Cape Town was just beginning its worst drought in approximately 500 years. And what we're going to talk about today is day zero. Day zero is a case study in near catastrophe. And I want to emphasize it's a case study because I want all of you to think about whether or not your agency could potentially face a similar issue, and if so, how you would solve the problems that Cape Town faced. As I mentioned, it's a case study in near catastrophe, and what day zero was the day that Cape Town was planning on turning off the taps. So stop a moment and think about this from the perspective of your own water agencies. This would have been the day that they turned off the taps. This is the day that there would not have been any water any longer for major businesses in Cape Town. They would have continued to provide water for emergency purposes to hospitals and the like, but your typical restaurant would not have had water. Your typical hotel would not have had water. None of agriculture in Cape Town, which is one of the major agricultural regions of South Africa, would have had water. They wouldn't have had water for sanitation purposes. Think about what happens if you no longer have water going into homes. Not only can't you turn on the tap, but furthermore, you're not able to flush your toilet at that particular point in time. They weren't sure how they were going to handle that particular issue. It also would have meant the day where most of South Africa's Cape Town would not have had effective fire suppression. Cape Town had actually invested in a number of compressed air foam fire trucks because they no longer would have been able to connect their fire trucks to fire hydrants and have expected that they would have the water to put out fires. So that's what day zero would have meant to Cape Town. Now, Cape Town is actually one of the last places I would have expected to face that type of day zero for several reasons. First of all, Cape Town actually gets a lot of water each year. The other name for that particular cape is the Cape of Storms because of the amount of rain that they generally get on a yearly basis. When Europeans came to Africa, they settled in Cape Town partly because of all the water that actually flowed out of Table Mountain. And the Khoi and the San people who were there before them were attracted to Cape Town because of the natural water flow in that particular area. The Cape Town Water Utility also had received awards for their effective management of water in Cape Town. Cape Town is probably the best managed city in Africa. It's managed by the Democratic Alliance, which is very different than the African National Congress. And as I mentioned, they had won awards for conservation measures. They had won awards for water recycling. At the time that day zero almost came to Cape Town, they actually were recycling about 8% of their wastewater, which is a higher percentage than the United States as a whole. They had reduced the amount of leakage from their water pipes so that they only had about 15% leakage, which is very good for Africa. But despite getting a lot of rain, and despite also being a well-managed water utility, they almost were faced with day zero. And one of the major reasons is what you see on this map. Cape Town had one basic water supply, and that water supply was the local catchment basins. So you see on this particular map the dams and reservoirs which supplied Cape Town with almost 100% of its water. This presented Cape Town with a basic problem when they began to run out of water. Now, actually, this was something that an expert commission in South Africa, the 1990 Water Research Commission, had actually predicted was going to occur. They predicted in 1990 that within 17 years, South Africa would run out of water and that Cape Town had to do something about this particular problem. This particular chart shows what they did, and what you'll see is at the very beginning of that slide, what things look like in the late 20th century. The dotted line is population increase in Cape Town, and then the blue line is the amount of water that they were supplying. And what you'll see is that for a period of time, they actually did try to expand their native water supply. They put in more dams and reservoirs in order to capture more water. And they continue to do this until the very end of the 20th century. At that point, however, they decided that they would do what everyone had told them they should do from the very outset, which was also to conserve water. And so you can see that even though the population levels in Cape Town continued to increase, that the amount of water that was being supplied to Cape Town flatlined at that particular point. They no longer were expanding their water supply. Instead, what they were doing was to try to meet the increasing demand by holding to conservation. They realized that there was a possibility that they would face a day when they were going to be confronted by multi-year droughts. but they went on a 99% probability estimate in figuring out what that meant in terms of their water supply. They planned actually for the 1 in 100-year drought situation, but what they didn't plan for was the 1 in 500-year drought situation. Furthermore, because they were relying upon conservation during this particular period, they also were seeing a hardening of demand. They were using up the easiest ways of conserving water and making it more difficult to conserve water when drought ultimately hit. And drought hit beginning in 2014. What you see on this particular map was in September of 2015, the drought situation in the southwest corner of South Africa. And if you look closely here, what you'll see is that the entire catchment basin of Cape Town was in a severe drought at this point. Right next to it, on the other side of mountains, they were getting plentiful rain, but there was no way, certainly on a short-term basis, to move the water from where it was actually raining to the Cape Town area. Now again, this was estimated at this particular point in time to be about a 1 in 500-year drought. Scientists at Oxford now estimate that as a result of climate change, it is more likely to be a 1 in 100-year drought situation. And that in fact, even if we are able to meet the Paris Climate Agreement goal of a 2% increase in temperature, this is going to move to a 1 in 33-year probability. So one of the lessons of this is you need to be aware of climate change. And you need to be thinking about those situations which you never thought were going to occur. Because the lesson of climate change is not the change in the mean. It's the increased likelihood of extreme events unlike anything that you have ever encountered before. And that's what happened in Cape Town. Now, when this happened, Cape Town, of course, started thinking about, well, how can we get more water? We know we're faced with a drought. We need to address this particular problem. And like actually many regions in the southern hemisphere, one of the first things they thought about was, well, could we tow icebergs from Antarctica to Cape Town? And this is a totally silly idea in most areas of the world. It's actually not that bad of an idea down in the Cape Town area. As you can see from this particular map, Cape Town is only about 1,000 miles from Antarctica, so you could probably tow an iceberg there for something which would not be extravagantly expensive and without having the iceberg actually melt. But it was too expensive in Cape Town's view. They also thought about desal. A lot of cities have turned to desal when they've been confronted by droughts. And again, they decided that that was too expensive. Instead, they decided to turn to conservation. Now, one of the problems is when the drought hit, actually conservation went down. People started using 10% more water than they were using before because it was a drier, hotter climate than it had been previously. And so within a 2-year period of time, Cape Town was faced with this particular slide. This was a slide that showed where Cape Town was at the end of last year. And you can see a beginning of a line on the left-hand side there, which actually was tracking where Cape Town's reservoir storage was. And if they track that storage down, there are two important lines to look at. There's the top line that you will see in the bottom portion of the chart and the line at the very bottom. What they knew they couldn't cross was that line at the very bottom, because at that point they were no longer going to be able to extract any water from any of their reservoirs. They would have been totally waterless at that particular point. So they drew that second line slightly above it with a notion of we have to make absolutely sure that we don't cross that particular line. And that line became the day zero line. That became the line that if they hit that, what they were going to do was to set up 200 distribution centers around the city of Cape Town. No one would be able to get water out of their taps any longer. Instead, you would have to go to one of these 200 sites, and there you would pick up your water for the day or for the week. So it was an enforced means of rationing. But in order to try to avoid day zero, because day zero, again, is the day that you turn off the taps, they also decided that they would reduce everyone's usage of water in Cape Town to a total of 50 liters of water per day. That's about 13 gallons of water per day. That is about 1/7 of the amount of water that is used by the typical American. It is about 1/9 of the amount of water used by the typical Westerner. So again, just think about what that meant. And so what they had to try to do was to figure out how are we going to get down to that particular level. And they did a variety of things. They tried nudging. Number one, and this was, by the way, what they anticipated that it would look like on day zero, with people lined up at the 200 different sites with their buckets in order to get water in order to return home. But one of the things they did was they began to publicize day zero. The whole concept of saying we're going to have day zero, and you can see on this particular slide, which was in early 2018, they projected that day zero was going to be April 21st. One of the whole goals of saying, hey, we're confronting day zero, was to try to get people to immediately begin drastically conserving water. They also, though, again, tried a whole variety of nudging approaches. They told everyone how much water they were using, how compared to their neighbors' use. People who got their water use down significantly got their names publicized in the newspaper. You could go online and see how much water was being used by individual streets in Cape Town, so you could see whether or not your street was doing well or not, with the notion that maybe they could make a contest out of this. They also reduced the amount of pressure in all of the pipes in Cape Town in order to try to reduce the amount of water that was delivered to individual homes. They also relied upon regulation. If you turned out to use more water than about 20% of Cape Townians, then you actually have the city of Cape Town come out and apply what they called a water management device to your particular house, which further reduced the pressure of the water that was coming into your particular house. And they had water police visiting individual members of Cape Town in order to make sure they were meeting water compliance operations. This particular Afrikaner here is visited by 3 police because he had drilled a bore well without the permission of the city. So Cape Town tried a variety of different approaches, and those approaches worked very effectively. They never got down exactly to 50 liters per person, but this shows on the left-hand side how much Cape Townians were using in 2015, with the darker colors being greater use. And then you see on the right-hand side how much they brought it down. Depending on the particular area, they brought down their use anywhere from 75 to 90%. Over that period of time. This wasn't easy. This is one of my favorite slides. You found this in restaurants throughout Cape Town. The faucet is turned off. You can no longer get water there, and instead you're supposed to use this hand sanitizer on the left-hand side. The whole notion of day zero actually scared away a lot of tourism for Cape Town. Probably the greatest impact, however, of this mammoth conservation effort was on agriculture. Agriculture got allocated 1/3 of the projected water supply. And when they ran out of that water at the end of February, they no longer got any more water. That led to 7,000 people being put out of work. It led to a reduction in the wine production for 2018 of about 15%. One subnote, and this gets back to one of the things that Jim mentioned earlier, however, was that the whole concept of day zero was a class issue. If you went out to any of the townships, those of you who've been to South Africa, you know, surround Cape Town. Townships like Khayelitsha, where people are living in poverty every day, they already were living on only 40 liters of water per day. So they didn't understand what the whole ruckus was about day zero. They thought conserving this much water was simple. As a result of all these various conservation measures, however, as well as relieving rainfall, this particular summer, day zero has been pushed out. It's been pushed out to 2019. This particular slide shows how close Cape Town is actually coming to the desired conservation goal. It still actually isn't at the desired conservation goal, but more importantly, it tells people the percentage of water now in reservoirs. As you can see at this particular point, it's up to about 25%. I looked this afternoon, it's now up to 60%. They do not plan to call off day zero until it gets to 80%, which is where the reservoirs were in 2014 before the droughts actually hit, but they're in much better shape than they were before. So the big question for Cape Town now is, what do we do to avoid a future day zero? And what they're planning on doing is primarily diversifying their water supply. Rather than simply relying upon surface water for almost 100% of their water supply, they are putting in groundwater wells so that they will also have groundwater options. They are planning on increasing the amount of water reuse from only 8% of their wastewater to about 20% of their wastewater, and they're planning on putting in desalination plants, even though, again, those are going to be more expensive than various other options. Working with various environmental groups, they're also considering other options. So one of the things they're thinking about doing is actually taking out a variety of invasive species from their catchment basins in order to try to increase the amount of water available in those particular basements. So the question that they are now faced by is, can they avoid day zero? Not simply this year, but in the future. And the one other cautionary tale, which I'll throw in at this particular point, is that conservation seems to be declining in Cape Town. Ever since they have postponed day zero until 2019, people are saying, we've solved the problem. We don't have to worry about anything. We can go back to our old practices. So for me, the Cape Town case study provides 5 lessons, but I'll just throw these out on a contingent basis because I'm going to be interested in what the 2 Jims' thoughts are on this particular issue and what your thoughts are on this particular issue. But these are my 5 take-homes. Number 1, expect the improbable, particularly in the day of climate change. We need to take into account those extremes that we never thought were going to occur. The second thing is, don't count just on conservation for getting us through our problems. Conservation, don't get me wrong, is extremely important, but those cities that just rely upon conservation may very well face the same type of problem that Cape Town did, where they have to conserve water and they've already used most of their conserved water to continue to grow. The third thing is to act sooner rather than later. Cape Town took 2 years basically to act, and by that point they were faced with a disaster situation. The fourth, and I was glad to see that all of you apparently agree with this, is to diversify your water supply. Don't just rely upon one source of water, rely upon as many sources of water as possible. And the final thing is, don't waste a crisis. People act during crises. In Australia, people acted during the Millennium Drought. In California, California acted during our most recent drought. But as soon as droughts are over and people think that they can go back to their old practices, they will. So those are my 5 lessons, and I really look forward to hearing all of yours. And with that, I'm going to turn things over to Jim.
It'll just turn on, okay. I'm going to stand up because, well, two observations. One, they have Klieg lights that you can't see anything, and the second is I feel like I'm 8 years old at the kitchen counter or something here, sitting at this table. Doug threatened to have the poll question be, will Denver hit day zero during my tenure at Denver Water? I successfully got that out of there. Interesting questions about there's certainly questions that keep me up at night in terms of managing a water supply for 1.4 million people, 25% of the state's population, and the concept that a day zero can happen is certainly a reality. We've seen it all over the world. I unfortunately missed your speech today, but I know that you have examples of cities all over the world. For those who've been, for example, to Perth, Australia, they entered into a program called Water Forever No Matter the Weather because their reservoirs just completely went dry. and they're no longer dependent on those reservoirs. So I'm going to go through Buzz's lessons and talk a little bit about Denver's planning effort, but I think the theme that we all should take home from this is that we cannot operate in silos. This is not just a problem that we're addressing from Denver Water's perspective. This is a regional and indeed a West-wide issue that we need to be working on together. And I would argue we're not doing a very good job of it given the pace at which we're seeing drought, long-term drought, and declining reservoirs hit the West, particularly the Colorado River Basin. So with regard to the lack of expecting the improbable or even the possibly impossible, from my perspective, if something's possible, from a utility perspective, we've got a plan for it. So at Denver Water, what we've done is we've undertaken on a scenario planning exercise where we have abandoned linear water supply planning, where we look at the past hydrology, look at past population trends, project those out into the future, look at a water supply gap, and then go out and find water to meet that gap. That no longer can meet the challenges that we face today. We look at the intersection of social, economic, environmental, and water supply factors and how they intersect to affect the type of growth that will occur within our service area, the type of growth and patterns that are happening around our service area, and how that will affect and impact our water supplies. And our obligation is to meet any one of those future scenarios going forward with a number of tools. So we're constantly in a planning process that never ends and is always changing. The conservation lesson is interesting because obviously on a municipal utility there's a lot of pressure politically, legally, to continue to conserve. And the chart that was up there for South Africa showing population and water supply, you could probably put a chart of Denver's water supply system and see exactly the same pattern of behavior, where we're using the same amount of water that we were using in the 1970s, for example, with several 100,000 more people within our service area. One of the things that we're doing in Denver Water is one of the dilemmas that we find is when to kind of book that conservation savings. At what point do you actually start selling taps on that conserved water and say, well, now we've secured that water supply? We have not begun to do that yet. The conservation savings that we're achieving, we do maintain a strategic water reserve within our water supply system. And in effect, those conservation savings are being booked against our strategic water reserve rather than being counted in what we call our firm yield, which really may not be a firm yield. We don't even use that term anymore, actually, because we know that no yield is firm. The single source question, I think, is interesting for a city like Denver where we don't have an ocean. We're totally dependent on surface water supplies. The amount of water that we can reuse and recycle is all of the imported water that we get from the Colorado River Basin. Obviously, under Colorado water law, we can't reuse and recycle South Platte water, which is about half of our water supply. So to the extent to which we maximize the efficiency and recycle and reuse our Colorado River supplies, we've just doubled down on the Colorado River in terms of risk, and made our reliance on that source of supply essentially twice, or if you consider that we can reuse that water up between 4 and 7 times, depending on the time of the year, we've just quadrupled our reliance on Colorado River water, which relates to our reliance both in Denver and on the Front Range, as well as in Colorado as a whole, on Lake Powell. And obviously those two questions came up as the cause of day zero on the poll as the top two winners. And certainly as a state, as a region, the analogy that Patty Wells coined that I keep using is that we see this train that's coming at us at 5 miles an hour, and if it hits us, it's our own damn fault, because we can just see that reservoir level going down. We have the tools in place. I know that there was a panel earlier about the DCP in the lower basin, the program that we're talking about in the upper basin to be able to manage water from upper Colorado River System Storage Project water down to Lake Powell at critical elevations, and then ultimately putting in place an ability to manage demands in the upper basin to be able to maintain critical water elevations in Lake Powell is going to have to be really important. It's going to be a tough series of conversations. For example, not just between the 4 upper basin states, obviously between the West Slope and East Slope in Colorado, whether that's done voluntarily in a compensated manner, which would be the preference, or whether it's done administratively, I think are questions that we're going to have to address. But somehow, what we see is that events can take over. They can take over more quickly than we could ever possibly anticipate, and it's important for us to have those tools in place, and hopefully we never have to use them. Acting sooner rather than later. It's a lesson that I've harped on the Colorado River for years, that we need to get ahead of the curve. But it's a lesson that I think is staring us right in the face on the Colorado River. I don't want to wait for the crisis, but it is here, and it's possibly here in 2020 in the lower basin if Arizona doesn't get its act together, come up with a participation in the lower basin DCP, and be able to move forward. The shortages that Arizona could face could be quite significant. And again, to underscore the uncertainty that's involved, a warming climate, that's something that's we built into our climate change, our scenario planning process, is not just a water supply concern. We've seen and are seeing the impacts of devastating catastrophic fires. The impact on our water systems can be significant and catastrophic. We will see it in increased demands and increased heat within our service areas. We will see increased costs for water treatment as we have warmer water, emerging contaminants. We will see it in increased regulatory environment. We're already seeing it in terms of Safe Drinking Water Act. We're going to continue to see it in terms of Endangered Species Act regulatory environment. And we have, frankly, a regulatory environment that's not adaptable to changing climate. It's based on the past, and it's based on an assumption that the future will look like the past. Whether it's our interstate water allocation systems that are based on over-assumptions of water supply, whether it's our water right allocation system that are based on past hydrology, or whether it's our regulatory environment that are based on past water temperature and water quality parameters. Those are all geared to the past and not to the future. Obviously in Colorado, where we are dependent not just on single sources of watersheds, but a single source of supply in terms of snowpack, we see that reservoir diminishing as we see a warming climate, which to me argues for the continued need for additional flexibility through increased storage in the state, and something that Denver, along with other Front Range municipalities, is working hard to achieve. We're going to need to work together to see how we can utilize the Denver Basin as a buffer against those unexpected events, not as being dependent on the Denver Basin, but being able to tap into the Denver Basin as needed to buffer against those unexpected events. And we're going to need to be aware of the social, economic, and environmental impacts of climate change. I mean, all those factors are, as we look at the warming climate, some of the scenarios in our scenario planning are actually pretty scary, and they will be coming at us more and more quickly. So I think those are good lessons. Hopefully, not only, again, I'll end where I started by saying that from Denver's perspective, it's a situation where no municipality, no municipal water utility can go it alone in terms of trying to deal with these issues. We need to collaborate on sustainable watershed management, for example, and aquatic health. We need to collaborate with our neighbors on drought resiliency, utility to utility. We need to work with the agricultural community to make sure that we can move water between the agricultural and the urban sectors in ways that keep irrigated agriculture viable and a living, thriving entity within the western United States. And we need to work together between East Slope and West Slope to collaborate on how we protect Colorado as a state from the looming threat of shortages on the Colorado River Basin as a whole. So with that, we'll do the conversation. And
Yeah, it's quite a list. So let me throw a question back at both of you. I mean, when I teach water law, and it's applicable in day zero, I mean, if they're following water supplies, you've basically got two strategies. You can either use less or you can get more, right? So you talked about conservation, not a lot of talk about pricing, so I'm curious your thoughts on that. For getting more, you talked about transferring. What you didn't talk about, which is obviously a third rail politically, but is to actually condemn ag water, which in a day zero situation, I think is a scenario one needs to consider, obviously politically very controversial. Desal you talked about. You didn't talk a lot about reuse, which with the yuck factor actually is an issue, but I've always heard there's a lot of potential. So I was curious if Jim, if you could talk from the Denver perspective, and Buzz, if you could shift now to the California vantage on which tools you think, if you only choose 2 or 3 to really push to try to stave off day zero situations, which would you focus on?
Okay, so is this on? Okay, great. So several thoughts on what you just brought up, Jim. First thing is, I just want to clarify, and I think, Jim, you really brought this out in your particular comments. I think using less is one of the solutions to making sure that we are able to meet our water needs in major areas like Denver. The problem which Cape Town had, and it sounds like it's the problem you're avoiding, is that they used that conservation to then grow. They actually dedicated all of that conserved water to new connections. And that meant that that water was not available when they needed it at a later point in time. So conservation is great, but that conservation needs to be banked so it's available as effectively another source of water at a later point in time. In terms of finding new sources of water, I think in the western United States and as we saw in the Cape Town area, cities are going to look to the agricultural areas to see whether or not there's water available there. And effectively what Cape Town did was a form of condemnation of the agricultural water supply. They decided that they would give agriculture a set amount of water, and when agriculture was out of that water, they didn't have any water that they could utilize at that point. Effectively, what they did was they took the water that had been allocated to ag, they took a portion of that, and they gave it to the city instead. My own view is that that's not the best approach, but that instead the type of water markets, dry year options that we have been talking about for many years and that cities throughout the West are now trying is the best approach to solving that. Reuse, I think, actually has a lot of opportunities down the road. There's a lot of new technologies being developed today to permit us to actually reuse water on a distributed basis, on a neighborhood basis, and technology which is, I think, very soon going to permit us to actually generate more electricity than is used in the recycling process so that we can take that wastewater and not only get water out of it, but also get energy and various other valuable sources out of that water. The problem, though, with water reuse is the one that Jim brought up earlier, which is if you are reusing Colorado River water and you lose that Colorado River water, then reuse helps you a little bit, but not very much, because that water isn't going to be there to reuse at that particular point in time. I just want to throw sort of one more little bombshell out there because there's a potential sixth lesson here, and that is that at some point we may need to stop growing. The lesson in Cape Town might be that they grew beyond the available water supply. And I know that's something that we never really like to talk about, but particularly in those regions that can't diversify, that's something that people need to think about.
Well, yeah, stop growing. Who wants to try that?
How about those Rockies?
Yeah, the other dynamic I think that's interesting to me is the human behavior dynamic. You mentioned that water use is going back up in Cape Town, and It was interesting to look at California, particularly some areas in Southern California, immediately after the California drought was declared over, and I know it's not over in all parts of California, but water use just went right back up to where it had been before, and kind of problem solved. We'll just go back to normal life. One of the things that we do in Denver is message conservation every single year, whether it's a wet year or a dry year or a normal year or whatever it may be. We're constantly hammering our customers about efficiency and conservation and the need to use less. And I think as a result, we're able to sustain those conservation savings that we've achieved. And you can see it in terms of the water use in the Denver metropolitan area that very closely follows weather patterns. So if it's raining, our demands immediately go down. If it's hot, they'll go up, but they'll immediately go up and down with the weather patterns.
Okay, we've got time really for just one more question, really. I don't know if there's anything you want to mull over, or I can throw another one your way. And so I guess one of the things I think it's worth focusing on is this really a political will issue? Is it a money issue? Is it a management issue? Is it all of the above? And again, it's in terms of priorities, where you think the opportunities are now that day zero has become something people understand.
Right now, we're in the I'll use the dynamic of the Colorado River as you see a looming crisis coming our way, and you could see it. You can go up and down the river and see the dynamic of kind of self-protection and everybody holding their cards and looking across the table and trying to figure out what cards the other party is holding. So Metropolitan and the Imperial Irrigation District are looking at each other and the Salton Sea comes into play. Arizona looks at California. Indian tribes and municipalities and agriculture in Arizona all are staring across the table at each other. The upper basin is staring at the lower basin. The 4 upper basin states are staring at each other. And of course, in Colorado, we have the West Slope and the East Slope that are looking at each other and trying to figure out kind of where the targets lie and who's going to get hurt at whose expense. And somehow we're going to have to continue to work hard, and I believe that there is some political will that is out there, and I'm cautiously optimistic that we can have the tough conversations that are necessary to achieve a sustainable water future on the Colorado River, starting with Colorado and moving across the Colorado River Basin. The water is there, I think, at least for the foreseeable future, to be able to manage across all of those sectors and not have everybody be sacrificed and not have there be a free-for-all. But the urgency is now, and the crisis is here, so let's take advantage of it.
So I would agree largely with Jim. So your question a moment ago was, is it a management issue? Is it a money issue? Is it a political issue? I don't think it's largely a management issue, and we can just look at all the people in this room and realize that all of you are actually doing a fantastic job managing your water supplies with the capabilities that are available. I think there are some ways that probably management could be improved. There was a recent survey of California water agencies that showed that actually most California water agencies are not using the most recent climate models and projections in order to actually figure out what they need to do in terms of their water supply. So there's some ways that management could be improved, but as a general matter, I think management is quite good. Second of all, on money, I actually think there's a fair amount of money out there right now to solve most of our problems. I think in the water field we are always starved for resources, and it would be nice if we could actually find a way of, through bonds or through increasing prices, to actually bring more money into the water field. But again, I don't think that's a major problem. I think the major problem, as Jim just suggested, is one of political will. And that comes back again to don't waste a good crisis. There are 2 problems of waiting until after the drought to do something. Number one, conservation frequently goes back up, but the other thing is that the political will that is needed to solve a lot of these problems frequently doesn't exist after the crisis has ended. In California, I can go through each of our major droughts and tell you what the major policy improvements were as a result of that. Back in our 1970s drought, that led to new conservation measures. Our 1980 to 1990 droughts, that led to new water marketing laws. Our most recent drought, that led to our Sustainable Groundwater Management Act. Each time we take a step up, but then we plateau until the next time that we face a drought. And so I think the big question is, how do we solve problems like the Colorado River when we realize that drought is down there, but we still think, just like you suggested a moment ago, Jim, that train's coming at 5 miles an hour and maybe it will never get to us.
All right, it's been an incredibly rich discussion, and I feel we just sort of scratched the surface, and there's a lot more to be said, but there's also the next panel. So please join me in thanking both Buzz and Jim.